Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Archaeology with Flint Dibble. And I am here with a really special guest, Dr. Moudhy Al-Rashid. As I was fangirling over her just a second ago, she has, for a long time, been one of my favorite historians and scholars of the ancient world on the internet. In fact, I got my start doing Twitter threads back in 2018, and I was trying to emulate Paul Cooper and her, and the kind of threads that they would write. Here, wait, let me just quickly pull one up. And yeah, so she has been writing Twitter threads and now Blue Sky threads for a long time. And they're always beautifully illustrated with cuneiform and just lovely little stories from the past. And so, I mean, I'm just a huge fan. And the coolest thing is that this video is sponsored because of the fact that I have a book. And not only that, I have the very, wait, where did it go? No, I have to brag. I have the very first autographed book that Moudhy sent out because her publisher had sent it to me late. So, so I'm totally honored to have you here, Moudhy. I really, really appreciate you for joining us. And your book, Between Two Rivers, was just published today, yeah?
That's right, publication day. Yeah, thank you for having me. It's just such a special way to get to celebrate something. So
yeah, I'm really excited to chat about this, and I really recommend this book heavily to everybody watching. It's just Moudhy is a great writer. She learned how to write on Twitter just like I did, and we were just chatting about how writing really short makes it so you have to learn how to write. And she's just a really brilliant storyteller. So check it out. Let me pop the link. Oh wait, where'd the link go? Let me pop the link in the chat really quickly to the Hatchet website. So, okay, sorry. Moudhy, tell me about yourself. How did you get into cuneiform?
thank you. Yeah, well, thanks for having me. Thanks for saying that was such a lovely thing that you just said. And you're right. Writing Twitter threads forces you to write things in a way that anyone can enjoy, digest, and learn something. And yeah, so it's definitely an exercise in learning how to write a book or something longer. The book is basically one long Twitter thread. Yeah, without pictures, sadly. Yeah, so I mean, I came to cuneiform and the field of Assyriology, which is the study of this stuff, in a really random way, which is that, like any super cool person in their 20s, I decided one summer to take a course on the Book in the Ancient World. That's literally what it was called. And the first day was on cuneiform tablets. It was taught by Irving Finkel, Dr. Irving Finkel, who's a curator at the British Museum. And I just fell in love. It was June. Not with Irving, although he's wonderful, but with the tablets. It was it was June, and it was too late to apply anywhere. But there was one place that was taking rolling applications, which is Oxford. So I applied there, and I got in, and I just kind of changed the course of my life. I was supposed to go to law school, but yeah, it's probably for the best because I did not do so great on the LSATs.
I think so. And now you get to study about ancient lawyers and things like that. So it's similar. And you're still at Oxford, right? You're an honorary fellow at Wolfson College, I think, if I remember.
That's right. Yes, my last research fellowship expired in September, and I got put on as an honorary fellow, which is wonderful because it means I can keep doing all the public history and outreach that I do. That I have, I think is just the best part of what I do.
Yeah, I'm with you too. That's why we're here right now, trying to share this with the public. Yeah. So one of the cool things about this book is it's just filled with so many different stories from the past. And that's what Moudhy is just, I mean, you're an expert, obviously, in actual research and scholarship, but you're also an expert in trying to translate this for a public audience. So, okay, what is cuneiform and what are we looking at? This looks like my handwriting. I was always told that my handwriting is chicken scratch. And I wish I had this image so I could say, no, this is chicken scratch.
I can't remember who said that. It might have actually been Irving Finkel, that cuneiform looks like a bird has just run across some clay. And in a way, yes, but I think the triangles are beautiful. So, or maybe I think chicken scratch is beautiful. I don't know. Maybe they do look good. I just think both are gorgeous. So cuneiform, which is what we're looking at, is a writing system from ancient Mesopotamia. And ancient Mesopotamia is a region, not a civilization. And it refers to the area between and around the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now Iraq and Syria. And
Wait a second. So you're saying your title, Between Two Rivers, The Birth of History in Mesopotamia, is redundant?
Sort of. I think Mesopotamia is between the rivers, so maybe it's not like completely redundant. There's a little clarification there. But the region was home to lots of different civilizations, some of which may sound familiar, like the Babylonians and Sumerians. But one thing they had in common, even though they didn't share a language always, was that they shared this incredible writing system that thankfully they impressed into clay largely, but also stone, like the photo here, which means it's survived. Everything that they wrote down, more or less, has some element of that has survived, and I just think that's incredible because they've told us they leave behind everything from receipts in really mundane things to milestones in history, like really advanced math for calculating the movement of planets across the sky and everything in between. And what we're looking at here is a royal inscription. I think it's from Nimrud, and it's from a palace relief, and it is basically just recounting some battle or other and all the wonderful things a particular Neo-Assyrian king did in the first millennium BC.
Okay. Yeah. And so this one's actually on stone. So I didn't know that they had many stone ones like this. That's cool. I guess some of the more royal like decrees and inscriptions and things like that were for more posterity's sake.
Yeah, more sort of definitely things like royal inscriptions made their way. They were also recorded in clay, but they made their way onto stone, and more monumental, bigger inscriptions that more people could see, even if they couldn't necessarily read it, and interspersed with art. So the Neo-Assyrian reliefs, reliefs from the first millennium BCE in Assyria, the early part of it, are just stunning. I mean, the artistry is like nothing. I don't know how they planned these giant slabs out and the level of detail, but the cuneiform that they include in it, sometimes they serve like captions to say like what is happening in a particular scene, but sometimes they're just standard royal inscriptions saying all the great things about a particular king and battles that they won, that sort of thing. So that's what stone would have been used for, but typically everything was on clay. And I mean, I picked it because it's on stone. It's like perfect.
Yeah, exactly. I can see
Right.
that. This is
No
like
mistakes, yeah.
really neat chicken scratch.
Exactly. Very
Yeah,
organized.
exactly. So the clay tablets, are they intentionally baked or are they accidentally baked from like a fire?
Both. So
Okay.
things that were, I mean, this I think is something that we're still trying to work out, what determined what got baked or not. But typically something important like a textbook, like a scholarly textbook might get baked.
Hmm.
Um, but something like a receipt, why bother?
Yeah.
But, receipts were kept in buildings that sometimes burned down during, battles, so they ended up getting preserved, but the clay also would just dry, and even if it didn't get baked or sun-dried, it would still dry enough that most of it would survive regardless. And this lovely photo is I picked this because it shows how different cuneiform looked in its earliest stages when it's still called proto-cuneiform, and the signs are just traced into clay instead of impressed, instead of pushed with a reed stylus. And this is from basically the dawn of writing, where the signs, the characters look like the things they represent. Whereas in the previous slide on stone, it was a lot more stylized or schematized. You can't really tell that a sign once represented a foot, like at the bottom of the one on the left. For example, you can see like a
Right
foot
here.
sideways, or some barley, like fronds is not the right word, but you know what I mean. Leaves of
Right here.
barley. Um, so yeah, so in the earliest stages, when they were still developing this new technology, this is what it looked like, and it just changes so much over time. And you can really trace. You can sort of look at a tablet and say, "Oh, this is from the second millennium," or "This is from the latest stages of cuneiform," because you can just sort of tell from the font being used, more or less.
And so this is in Sumerian, these early ones?
We think that's a really
Okay.
good question. There are no clues about the language being used, but when cuneiform does start to have clues, that language is Sumerian, and we can say that with a bit more confidence. So we think it was reflecting words in Sumerian, but we don't really know. It's such an interesting thing that we don't really know.
I should have asked if I could put you on the spot here or not in advance, but I'm going to ask, and you can say no.
Mhm.
So, can you walk us through this tablet since it's a earlier, hopefully simpler one? So these are logograms, so they represent different goods and amounts, I'm guessing?
That's exactly right. So I cannot read this, but I can tell you what it is.
Okay.
Like I can't go through and say this is what this sign is. So the circles or the kind of half
Mhm.
moons, those are numbers. And then the ones that look like drawings of things are the things being counted. And this is
Okay.
basically an account, so like a kind of a total of objects that are counted. It's the sexagesimal system, so a base 60 numerical
Huh.
system. But unfortunately, because we have quite a limited understanding of the signs, it's really hard to know exactly what this is about or what the kind of total reflects or what's being counted. We can guess, or people who specialize in this era can guess, because the signs look similar enough to later versions of them that we can say, okay, maybe that's a bowl or maybe that means walk. But we're not with any real certainty that we can firmly say, definitely this is what this says.
Okay. So it's not due to you not knowing it, it's due to the fact that nobody can translate this exactly right now.
Yeah, I mean, people have definitely offered
Yeah,
translations
that's yeah.
with the caveat that it's like we're not 100% sure, and I'm not even qualified to like offer such a thing, but so yes and no to that question.
Okay.
Some people really specialize in early writing, and it's incredible. I thought that that's what I was going to do when I first started, but then I fell in love with the history of science, and I couldn't really shake that.
Very, very cool. Okay, so these are the very earliest. Are these kind of receipts, goods, and stuff like that? We
Mhm.
have this, for example, much later in Greece, but the earliest written Greek is Linear B, and it's sort of same idea of these receipts with goods in, goods out. And then I'm guessing this is here to show the adaptation over time of some of these symbols.
Yeah, exactly. So you can see on the left, the earliest versions of things look like the top one looks like a face, the second one
Hmm.
looks like a bowl. And then in the second column at the very bottom, it's a face and a bowl to say, eating. I think.
Very, I
So
like that.
yeah, exactly. Which I think is it's amazing that they kind of managed to put enough signs and represent enough words, visually to be able to create a verb. Um,
Hmm.
so, but then it's quite laborious to trace into clay. I mean, I personally haven't tried it, but I can imagine how long it would take to do that. So, at some point, they worked out that it was actually much easier to push the reed stylus, and you can do it quite quickly. Just pushing a reed stylus into clay and create a lot more wedges to make a lot more signs. And then by the end of the cuneiform culture, they're really quite streamlined. And
Okay.
to me, much easier to read, even though they don't look like the things they represented.
Interesting. So it starts off as these kind of visual things that you can see what they represent and you can sort of see. And then eventually they start to say, well, I guess about 1,000 years later or less even, they just start doing these impressions, which still sort of resemble, but then eventually become so stylized that they're their own things.
Mhm.
But these are not alphabets per se. Oftentimes each word has its own symbol. What would be the right word for it? Uh,
Yeah, I think you said logograms earlier, which is
yeah.
exactly right, which is basically a sign or a character that stands for a whole word. I think
Mhm.
pictograms has been used in the past sometimes for that. Um, but then eventually the writing system or the scribes did a really good job expanding what all those signs could stand for, and it made it possible for the signs to stand for just sounds instead of words. Like if you think of English, for example, okay, it's easy to maybe easy is not the right word because I can't draw, but if you want to draw a face, it's okay to draw a face to represent face. But what about more than one face? What about the plural s faces?
Mhm.
So how do you generate enough values for the signs to be able to reflect other elements of language that are not things in the world that are easily drawn, or things like happy, or even something like eating, a verb. So they did a really incredible kind of development in the early stages of the script to make each sign stand for enough things that they could reflect language and eventually reflect unrelated languages. as well.
Yeah, because how many different languages is cuneiform actually used for?
I should really know, like, the answer to that like this. I, like, always forget. I think it's
But
12.
like 12, okay, yeah, so I was gonna say like 10 or 30 or 5 or okay, so about 12-ish.
Yeah,
Um,
and and
Interesting.
and a lot of them are so Sumerian, as far as we know, is not related to any known language. That's sometimes contested. But Akkadian, which is a later language that cuneiform was modified to write or further developed to write, is a Semitic language. So it's related to Arabic. And completely different to Sumerian. Like in the first year of my degree, I had to learn both, and it was like so hard because you go from one, to me really regular kind of grammar system, which was Akkadian, to the minefield of Sumerian, which is not fully developed, which is so interesting, and not fully deciphered, which is so interesting, but very confusing to try to learn the two in tandem, just to show how unrelated they are. And
Yeah,
how
I had to learn ancient Greek and Latin at the same time, so I know that struggle a little bit. And it's something that I'd not really thought of with cuneiform before reading your book. Was sort of like, oh wait, it's used for all these different languages that are so different, but it's the same experts that do them. And so yeah, it gave me a greater appreciation for all y'all reading this chicken scratch here. So, okay, so that gives us a sense of the language. And how long was it written for? When did it eventually stop being written?
I think, as far as I know, the last datable cuneiform tablet, that datable is kind of important because there may be ones that were later, but we just can't say for sure, is from 79 to 80 CE. So we're out of the BCE era. And it's an astronomical almanac. So it's a record of astronomical phenomena that happened in 79 CE.
Huh.
Yeah.
That's an interesting date since Vesuvius erupted that year.
Oh, is it? I didn't know that.
Yeah, I
Okay.
wonder if that's odd
That
actually.
is odd.
Huh.
That's a very coincidence.
Yeah. Um, so wait, 79. Am I just totally screwing this up? Am I being an idiot? No, I was right. August. That's a future video on which month Vesuvius erupted it. Does it mention an eruption of a volcano in there?
I don't think so. It's quite a broken tablet. It's funnily enough
Okay.
shaped like a triangle, like a wedge. So it's like broken diagonally.
Okay.
So a lot of it's missing, but from memory, it's just astronomical phenomena that get described. But I don't know. I'd have to go back and see if any weather phenomena, because they do sometimes describe weather when they talk about.
Yeah. I'd be intrigued because one of the biggest debates in Pompeian archaeology right now is when Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD.
Okay.
So it's something I wrote a couple of popular Twitter threads on a while ago, and I'm working on adapting it into a video. And so it's sort of like, what kind of markers do we have for seasonality in the archaeological record? Because Pliny the Younger mentions that it erupted in August, but we have like fruits and fish that seem to suggest it actually erupted later than that in like October or the fall. And so there's a range of evidence that is now building to show that, and we think that the text in Pliny is corrupt in a sense. And there's some even like a coin that doesn't make sense if it's not till later. And so it'd be interesting if there's a cuneiform tablet that actually could help solve this question. That would be kind of interesting.
That would be the best plot twist. So
Yeah.
this is a really ignorant question, but would Vesuvius have had like an impact on weather all the way in Iraq? Like when Krakatoa erupted and we had like a winter.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's possible to some degree. I'm not sure actually. I that would take some research to look into how that volcanic ash is modeled to
Mhm.
have moved. I mean, so we don't have great evidence for that it's modeling of it. But yeah, there have been people that have worked on that. I'd have to look into the scholarship, but I would not be surprised if there's something. I mean, it might not have been so pronounced. So when volcanic eruptions happen, it actually, so what it does is it creates this kind of haze in the sky that makes sunsets look more brilliant for like the year or two afterwards. And people have studied like medieval and Renaissance paintings of sunsets, and they can actually link up more brilliant sunsets to the years following major volcanic eruptions. So it does actually have an impact. Yeah, I heard this cool lecture at this conference I went to on climate change. And so it was really cool, really, really cool. I should do a video on that. That would be fun too. But I have too many videos to but yeah, so there could have been some sort of impact, but it might, who knows if it was that noticeable or not, is tough to tell. Yeah. Like if it would have darkened the sky, probably not. It might not have been so dramatic that far away.
Okay.
But it probably would have had some effect, just it depends on how dramatic. So last question for you before we dive into the context of the book and the stories that the cuneiform tells.
Mhm.
So how the heck was this chicken scratch deciphered, decoded?
It is a very, like, disjointed story,
Huh.
involving, like, unrelated efforts that eventually converged. But, primarily, there were these trilingual inscriptions in Iran, um,
Hmm.
and they're all in cuneiform, and they reflect 3 different languages. So one eventually we knew was Old Persian, and Elamite is the other language, and Akkadian, or was called Babylonian by the early scholars, was the
Okay.
third language. So these inscriptions were copied by someone called Karsten Niebuhr, who
Hmm.
I
I've heard the name.
technically not Danish at the time because I don't know if Denmark existed yet, but if Denmark had existed, he would be Danish, and I think he's often identified as a Danish a scholar. So he copied these down, and they were worked on by various different philologists, and then eventually Rawlinson ends up going to Iran, and he finds the Behistun inscription, which in kind of retrospect becomes like the Rosetta Stone of decipherment, even though decipherment was already well underway before he made copies of this monument. And it's an enormous monument carved into a rock face, and for once we can actually say it was chiseled and carved, the cuneiform was, instead of impressed into clay, describing a particular battle of Darius, and depicting the king, the Persian king as well, the Achaemenid king. So yeah, and then after that, there was a sort of everyone sort of separately worked on all these signs, and then eventually there was a competition that the Royal Asiatic Society, I think, held, where they said, okay, well, if we think we're close to decipherment, I'm going to give this inscription to 3 people, and if they come up with something similar, then we know that it's been deciphered, and they did. So it was really quite a piecemeal, disjointed kind of effort. It would make probably not the best Netflix series, but hopefully somebody will make it anyway someday.
These Netflix series, they always over dramatize stuff anyway, so it doesn't really, they'll work in some extra drama to make it fun.
There is a bit of drama actually that they could do a whole story on, which is that Rawlinson and Hinks. So Hinks is another scholar that worked on these, and I think he's the kind of unsung hero of it all, because what he did is that he matched up the really formal, beautiful, perfect signs that were on the rock inscription to the messy clay tablets, to the signs on the messy clay tablets, which opened up thousands more texts for people to use for decipherment. But Rawlinson didn't really like him for whatever reason, so he tried to push him out of his, like, scholarship or whatever it was at the British Museum. I'm getting the exact details wrong. So there was a little bit of a weird rivalry there that I think, if Netflix, if you're listening, whoever you are.
I don't think Netflix likes me very much because I
Okay.
regularly criticize their shows. So,
We'll find someone else then. Amazon
yeah,
Prime.
exactly. I'm guessing they
Not maybe
probably blacklisted my channel on Netflix because I have torn apart a few of their shows in pretty dramatic ways.
good, as you should.
So let's get back to the book. So this book, one of the fun things about this book is it's framed around the story of what is potentially the world's first archaeological museum. And so that's found at Ur,
Mhm.
and here is the Ziggurat. So yeah, what are we looking at here? I mean, the Ur is massive. It's just such a big site. Going back to undergrad days, one of my first advanced classes I took in undergrad was a GIS class, and I got to digitize the entire royal cemeteries of Ur.
Oh,
And
wow.
yeah.
That is incredible. Yeah, so Ur is an incredible site, just as you said, and this is a photo of the Ziggurat in the 1920s. I think it's from 1923 to 24, which is about near the beginning of excavations of the city. Excavations were led by someone called C. Leonard Woolley for 11 of the 12 seasons. The 12th season was led by Catherine Woolley, who is often just called his wife, but she was an incredible archaeologist in her own right and very talented at drawing and preserving the artifacts as well. And in this ziggurat complex, there was a dwelling or a house, even maybe a palace for a princess and priestess, which was a priestess of the moon god at Ur, who was the central god of the city of Ur. And starting in the 2300s BCE, possibly a bit earlier, the king would traditionally install his daughter, one of his daughters, so always a princess of sort of royal blood, in this role of high priestess to the moon god. It was called the Entu or En priestess, En in Sumerian, Entu in Akkadian. Really hard to find create a direct translation of it, so it's often just left untranslated. And this office or this role continues for centuries, and then it eventually dies out. And sometime in the 6th century BCE, the last independent Babylonian king Nabonidus decides to resurrect the office and rebuild the palace or the dwelling of the princess there in this ziggurat complex. And he installs his daughter Ennigaldi-Nanna into it. And when excavators found the palace and started excavating it, they found objects from way earlier periods in a particular room. So, for example, they found a boundary stone, which is sort of like a tombstone-shaped thing that there is a picture of somewhere, but we can get to it when we get to it. That's from almost 1,000 years earlier, so it'd be like 800 years earlier. They found school tablets. They found a mace head that looked like it was the oldest thing in there. They found something from 1800 BC. Basically, they found a bunch of stuff that was just not supposed to be there. And Leonard Woolley decided that the best explanation for this was based on a key that he found, a so-called key that he found, which is this kind of thimble drum-shaped object that basically is a record of another object, and it says that the object is on display. So he thought that the collection of out of time objects might have been an ancient museum. And I think, it's very evocative, and it's a very interesting clay tablet. I mean, it's not shaped like a tablet, this clay drum, because it has 2 fonts on it. You can't really see it here.
So how large is this?
It's not big. It's a couple of inches.
Okay. And so basically, so this is kind of cool. This is like a story out of Indiana Jones, like literally out of the latest Indiana Jones game. If you're playing Indiana Jones in the Great Circle, he keeps finding objects that are out of time, and he ends up at Ur. And I'm not going to spoil the ending of the game, but at some point you can start putting some of these objects out of time into place, and it's at Ur that you do that. And so so there's something there that I think the creators of the game, they got a lot of inspiration from pseudo-archaeology, but also real archaeology. And this is something that, like, having you've excavated, or you've just done survey? I forget.
I've just done survey.
Okay.
As an epigrapher, so I'm always the dork that reads stuff.
But so sometimes when you're excavating, you find sort of this layer that has a bunch of mixed stuff, and usually that's just due to the fact that it's like leveling fill. So they're just shoveling in stuff from different areas into one layer. But in this case, there's sort of this intriguing thing where it's all these nicely preserved, let's say, tablets from different periods, and objects. And then at the same time, this one drum is, I guess, the key to it that suggests that describes this earlier brick that it's claiming is actually on display, which is, so this is the world's first museum, which is just insane, or at least possibly, yeah.
Yeah, possibly, exactly, because there are other possible ways to explain it, although this object is even still now gives people pause because of the way that last bit of it is worded, that this brick, it gives the circumstances of discovery of a brick, which we didn't find. No, I say we, I wasn't there, but which was not found. And then it says that it was put for viewing. The Akkadian word is tam martu, I think, which is for viewing or for display. So that's a bit strange. strange. But there are other ways to explain it. I mean, there could be accident of discovery. Something could have poked up from a lower layer or crumbled from somewhere else. People in Mesopotamia did like to find old things and reuse them. This was a very common thing. I mean, it was partly because it makes sense to reuse like a brick, for example. Why would you make a whole new brick when you have a perfectly intact older brick that you can just use? But also because things are maybe nice. Like, for example, also in the same building, they found a reused boundary stone, which was quite beautiful. That was part of a door frame. So it could have been something like that, bits and pieces that were all reused that just kind of ended up crumbling in the same area.
Okay.
It could have been a storeroom, because when Nabonidus would have arrived to Ur and decided, I mean, he describes in his royal inscriptions that it's an absolute ruin. There are palm trees growing everywhere. It's to tear everything out and rebuild this as it was in ancient times. So it could just be that these are things that were found in the course of renovation, and then they just kind of kept them in the palace for one reason or another. So there are other explanations, but the key, the drum-shaped museum label, which Leonard Woolley called the key, is still evocative. So it's
because that idea of spoliation, where you're reusing earlier stuff, sometimes it's just handy. But there's examples of churches in, like, I'm thinking of one in Athens, which is the metropolis there, and so it's purposefully built out of earlier inscriptions and sculpture, and so there is a sense of display there, but that's different from having a key like this that actually tells you the goal here is to display this, and like a brick of all things, right? Because I don't think
the book. If anyone wants to know why that particular brick would have been so special, you can find it in the book.
Yeah, and in fact, the entire book is framed around this kind of museum as the intro to each different segment on lives in ancient Mesopotamia, and so it gives this kind of evocative sense of I mean, that's why you call it the birth of history, because this is the first example, really, I guess, of museology, of displaying the past to show what was happening in the past in different ways from these humble objects, if you will. So yeah, do you want to walk us through a few of these?
Yeah, sure. So this is, I mean, that clay drum, you couldn't really see the font change on it, but the tablet, the broken one that you just had up, is a really nice illustration of how that top bit is in Sumerian. It's a copy of an inscription from 1800-ish BCE of a king of Uruk called Sin-Kashid, I think. And then the bottom bit, you can see it's smaller, and it's a totally different style, is in Akkadian, so again, a different language. And it's from the 600s, I think 603 BCE, and it's a scribe making a copy that so faithfully reproduces the font of something older. So that's what we see on the clay drum as well. It's just impossible to, the photos that are available don't show that font change, which I think is so cool.
Yeah, I agree. And this was your recent thread you just posted a few days ago on Blue Sky. Yeah, exactly. That is really cool. So in a sense, this scribe is copying the Sumerian here, but then recording how they copied it and why down here, if I'm reading this.
He's just, at the bottom, he's saying what he copied. I think he called it a tariff of Sin-Kashid, so some sort of inscription that is attributable to the king. And then he gives his name, his dad's name, his dad's name, and the date. And so it's quite a long signature section. But that's basically all he's writing is, I copied this, basically, and this is who I am, and this is what the day is.
And is this something that happens frequently? They copy stuff from hundreds of years earlier?
Yes, and they copy so faithfully. I haven't seen a lot of examples where they actually copy the style of writing. It's usually just the content in whatever font they are currently using. But they're so faithful that even if let's say there's a sentence that's like, the cow jumped over the, we know it's moon, it's like,
I'd say fence, but yeah.
Okay, fence. Okay. Like so many nursery rhymes in my head. But they wouldn't put moon in or fence in, whatever the prevailing interpretation would have. They would have put break to show that the tablet they're copying from is broken. So they were really faithful to their originals. They took it quite seriously when they were copying something that was older, to copy it as it was, even if they knew what should go there. Even
So
if
it's not like modern epigraphers who actually put those things in brackets,
it's
what they think should be restored there. Yeah,
exactly, exactly.
that's funny. Yeah, that's always a fun thing to play with, how we restore those kind of things.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is basically a good example like that. And this is a parallel for that brick that was on display.
Yeah, because I mean, obviously, if the original one being described was never found, but they found other bricks in ore that have the same inscription that's copied on the clay drum, with a few
Aha.
minor variations. So it's pretty cool that it's. I mean, these were stamped, so it's not out of. It's not nuts to imagine that the same inscription would have been stamped on more than one brick. Why would they bother making a stamp? Um, but yeah, so it's pretty cool that we have a couple of other parallels that have survived.
Yeah, brick stamps are a common thing throughout the Mediterranean. In fact, fun story, the
Okay.
Pantheon in Rome was recently redated from Trajan to Hadrian based off of brick stamps.
Really? That's so
Yeah,
interesting.
they found out that it was constructed over like 10, 20 years or something like that. And the latest brick stamps tell us that it's actually, yeah, to a different emperor than we thought.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing.
So what are these brick stamps telling us then? What are they there for? Why are they stamping? I'm guessing they're not stamping every brick, maybe like 1 in 100 or like for one for every load. That's how it was in the Roman world, at least.
Oh, that's a good. I actually don't know. That's a good. I
Okay.
don't. I mean, you're right. It's not every brick, but I don't know what the exact kind of um, ratio would be. That's such an interesting question. But yeah, they stamp the bricks to say what king basically is responsible for a particular building work or a particular thing that the brick is part of, whether it's a building or something else. But one of the great things about bricks is that they were often laid out to dry. Sometimes they were deliberately baked or otherwise heated to preserve them, but they typically would lay like tens of thousands of these things out to dry, and there are lots of animals walking around. So there and even people. So there are bricks with like footprints on them of a
Do you have
person.
one in here? No, you don't. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
I didn't. Yeah, I didn't go on nice. Or
That's
like
okay.
a dog print, and yeah. So
Oh
it's
man, I just saw one of the coolest ones on Blue Sky of this. They said it was a cat, but
oh,
I'm not sure. Let me see if I can find it.
okay.
Was it from Mesopotamia? I posted it, reposted it, but it was like a. Sorry, everyone. You're just gonna have to bear with me. You can keep talking, Moudhy, if you want.
Yeah, well, I mean, I feel like the bricks are probably they sound like they're not a very interesting topic, but I think they actually are because they can tell us a lot about what I mean, they can even tell us things about the mythology. Bricks, for example, in myth about Sargon the Great from the 2300s, the actual one, not the racist one. Sargon the Great from 2300s BCE. There's a myth where they dump a brick in the river and he has to run this relay race before the brick dissolves. So it kind of functions like a time clock. So it makes its way into myth and legend in really interesting ways as well.
Huh. That's actually cool. Yeah. So this is the one I was talking about. This is a piece of medieval pottery from Yemen,
Oh, cool.
and they claimed it's a cat paw, but I'm not sure what it is.
Oh, that is
Um,
cool.
but it's one of the wildest paw prints I've ever seen in a piece of pottery or brick, and I like to collect photos of these things.
Yeah.
And so this one was just that's why I remembered it. Yeah.
But you can even see the claws, unless I'm
I know. Yeah, yeah, yeah. You can very clearly.
that's
Yeah. And so this is why everybody should be getting off of Twitter and on the Blue Sky, because most of the scientific community and scholarly community has moved over to Blue Sky, and that's where you can find just amazing things like Moudhy's threads, my posts, these posts, and so just a pitch for Blue Sky to everybody.
yeah.
Okay, so the brick was the showstopper, obviously. That's why it actually had a label. The rest of them, I'm guessing, did not have a label that was found there in this potential
Correct.
museum.
Correct.
Um,
Yeah.
so what else was here? We have this statue fragment from Shulgi.
So the one on the right, which is it's like someone deliberately filed it down to preserve the bit of the statue that has still had an inscription on it.
Mhm.
But we don't know. Maybe they didn't do it on purpose. So yeah, that's the statue of King Shulgi, who ruled around 2100 BCE for almost 50 years. He's a very long-running king and quite an ideal king in all the things he achieved, as measured against Mesopotamian ideals for kingship, which were pretty stable throughout the many millennia of cuneiform culture. So yeah, so that would have been from 1500-ish years before the princess's palace, so really quite ancient to all the people that lived there.
Yeah,
Who
exactly. That would be like having a statue of, I don't know, Charlemagne or something like that.
yeah,
Um, So, okay, but Shulgi ruled in right? So he's one of the earlier rulers in do we have a sense that any of these objects were not from but were brought to for display?
Um, the only one that is a maybe is the mace head that was found, and that's only because it wasn't inscribed. And it's quite portable, I guess. But
That's
everything
not here,
else
is it?
is
Oh, here it
is
is.
kind of local. Yeah, I couldn't find a picture of the actual thing, but that
Okay.
was the drawing on site from the excavation. They had these little graph paper cards that they made drawings and notes on. So that's a drawing of what the mace head, and they I think Woolley described it as being uninscribed, which means there was no writing on it, which means there was really no way to date it, considering that it was amongst all these objects from the wrong time periods. So maybe. But I think it was quite a local collection. If it
Yeah,
was
that's
a collection at all, I think it was limited to stuff found in that area.
okay. So sorry, let's go back. So just to get a sense of this, the brick would have been from when? I forget
The
it.
brick is from the reign of Amar-suen, who was around the time of Shulgi, so
Okay. So
2100-ish.
both of these are from like 1500 years earlier.
Mhm.
And so this is a close up of, I guess, the inscription on it.
Yeah, and the one on the right is someone's hand drawn it. I can't remember who, but they've drawn out the cuneiform signs, which makes it way easier to read than if you're handling a 3D object.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. And then we have some of these school tablets. These are some of my favorite. I love school
Yeah,
tablets. So
me too.
walk us through. And this to me, you have one of your my favorite lines that you have in here is where is it? Let me find it. You say the first clay tablet I ever held, essentially a mundane accounting record, would have meant little more than a work email to the scribe who drafted it. But for me, it was a handshake with a stranger that transported me from a lonely room in the Ashmolean Museum to the busy, bustling neighborhood of ancient Uruk. Holding old things is the closest I will ever come to time travel. So connecting with those who came before me, connecting with those who came before me. So even that receipt felt like magic. To me, that's what school tablets are like.
Yeah.
Because there's something there about just sort of practicing your chicken scratch that I have done in my past.
Yep.
So yeah, so what kind of exercise is going on here? What are we looking at?
I think this is a lexical list of wooden objects. I can't really see, but it would have been one of the kind of curricular dictionary lists that students had to learn when they were learning cuneiform, and specifically learning kind of translation from Akkadian into Sumerian and vice versa. Because in many ways, education in Babylonia was centered on, I don't know how to use that phrase, Sumerian, and preserving this kind of dead, scholarly, authentic old language. But this is lovely because you can sort of see how on one side the writing is a bit bigger than on the other side. So typically with a school tablet, you'd have the teacher do the one copy and then the student would do a copy on the back. So you have these wonderful tablets, and I can really relate to why you love them so much, that are like this lovely, flawless copy of the teacher, and this absolute mess on the back that is like with fingerprints, and the font's too big and the writing's too big, and it's like not staying in the lines, and it's so relatable and so lovely. And it's also like a piece of kind of childhood from the past, really hard to find kind of evidence, like material culture for children. So I
Mhm.
think that the school tablets are really lovely. And Woolley and his team found fragments of school tablets as well in the palace, not in the same room as the other stuff. And it made him think that together with the museum, that Ennigaldi-Nanna, the princess who lived there, the high priestess, ran a school. I think that's like several steps too far.
Yeah, I think it's probably as well. But yeah, so
But
kind of cool. So wait, so school tablets, especially in this later period, they're oftentimes about learning how to translate or write Sumerian and updating it into Akkadian, which I guess makes sense in our schools today. You might be learning Latin or cuneiform, and you're gonna be doing your own little notebook to try to write it out. Um, do we have earlier school tablets as well that are in Sumerian, let's say, or is it mostly later period that we have school tablets?
probably, but I don't know because I'm sort of like I specialize mostly in things that are in Akkadian and
Hmm.
from about 2000 BCE onward. So I don't actually know about Sumerian schools. I know they had these lists from the very earliest writing, and they made them basically so that they could pass this knowledge on and people could learn how to use the writing system. I
Mhm.
think otherwise it would have just died out if they didn't create these kind of teaching tools. And those lists get reused and reused throughout all of cuneiform culture until the very end, really, almost in really sort of similar form to how they start, which is actually incredible. That's 3,000 years of a textual kind of discipline within that history, which is just so cool. So yeah, so this is an example of one of those lists. They go from learning how to do just a simple wedge by itself to lists of words to like multiple words. So like, I don't know, sheep, black sheep, blue sheep, whatever. I'm making this up, but adjectives, adjectives that can you modify so they could just learn more vocabulary centered on a particular sign or word. And then they move on to more complicated things like proverbs, contracts, and works of Sumerian literature, as well as pretty, cool math that they did, word problems that I like can't even translate because they stress me out so much because they're so confusing. So I can't imagine what.
The riddles and things like that. Yeah. Here, wait. I have some. Here we go. I was just at the Penn Museum,
Mhm.
and I have some examples of some school tablets
Oh,
practicing some math. Because the collection is split between the British Museum and the Penn Museum, and I did my undergrad at Penn, so that's
mhm.
why I did the stuff. So here they are. I think it was this one. They're practicing their times tables,
Yeah, the top
and
one.
so we see them practicing math and things like that. And
Yeah.
so yeah, so it's really cool to be able to find these kind of snapshots
Mhm.
of students learning all these kind of things and just writing it out over and over.
Yeah, it's so lovely, and making mistakes too, because
Yeah,
there's
exactly. Yeah.
which is just like lovely. I just love that so much.
Yeah, I'm teaching students zooarchaeology right now, and they're all like, they had their first exam on Monday, and so they're like, I keep making mistakes. I'm like, look, making mistakes is good. That's how you learn. That's
Yes,
how you get better. It's okay.
yes, yes, exactly. They're
Yeah,
steps in
exactly.
learning. They're necessary steps in learning, absolutely.
So
Mhm.
let's see, what other fun stories do we have? What's up with this cone then?
Yeah, this is a dedicatory. There's so many words that I, like, write and read, and I've never actually have to say them out loud, and then when I have to say them out loud, I'm like, "How do I say?" There's a great moment when I was reading the book for the audiobook where I was like, "The comet arced through the sky," spelled ARCED, and I was, like, reading, I was like, "And the comet arsed through the sky," and the guy the engineer was like, "That's not how you say that."
Really? Huh. I
Yeah.
would have said though arst, I guess, especially in British English,
Yeah,
you
yes,
don't want to say that.
not gonna work, yeah.
Yeah, so I can't be arsed to do that.
Yeah, exactly. We had a good laugh about it, but,
Yeah,
yeah, so
exactly.
that dedication or a votive inscription,
Hmm.
from a king called Kudur Mabuk. Well, he's not actually a king, he's a tribal leader who never actually calls himself a king, but his sons become kings. And this is from around 1800 BCE. Um, I am ironically like terrible with remembering exact dates, which is great for Assyriology because for lots of periods there are no exact dates, so it really suits my brain well. But the point being that it's about what would that be, 1200, 1300 years before Ennigaldi-Nanna's palace, so still very old to her.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
yeah,
But from a very different period from the earlier one, which is, I guess, part of the key here of everything being mixed up and out of time, rather
exactly.
than it just being, say, two layers mixed up. Yeah,
Yeah,
very, very cool.
yeah.
And then you have a boundary stone. I love boundary stones, and this
Me
has a
too.
nice,
They're
what is it, a cow on it?
they're so pretty. I think it's a dragon, I wanna say.
Or it's a dragon. Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, they're or dog,
Make it
maybe
bigger.
it's a dog, I'm not sure, I can't see.
Yeah, I
It's
can
too
try to make it bigger.
and then there's the lightning fork in front of the animal, whatever we decide it might be, which is, symbolic of the storm god Adad. Um,
Okay.
and I think behind the dog, there's, like, a pedestal with a giant cuneiform wedge on it, which is the god
Aha.
Na. I love that, the giant wedge just being the god of writing, Nabu. His
Yeah.
It's just so lovely.
I like how they also are representing writing
Mhm.
in they're depicting a written inscription on on a sculpture over a written inscription,
Yeah.
which is kind of very meta, if you see what I mean.
Yes,
Yeah.
it really is, yeah, it's very, very interesting. I love it. Yeah, so boundary stone again from this would have been from like 1500-ish BCE, so 1,000 years before Ennigaldi-Nanna, and as you made the point before, from a very different era to the other objects that we've already described. All theoretically in one room, but probably just under one roof, I think is enough.
Yeah. So what's going on? How were boundary stones used? Were these sort of more city boundaries or sanctuary boundaries or what?
Yeah, so these are really interesting objects. They're the culmination of a much longer kind of process of creating a written text, and they basically reflect kind of gifts of land from the king. It's like another way to buy land is to have it be given to you by the king. But sometimes they record like disputes over land and the outcomes of that. And I think this one is a dispute that ends with someone getting a particular tranche of land in Ur. And they're really interesting texts. I mean, I think they're interesting for their iconography. They have so much gorgeous iconography on them of different deities, and sometimes they'll have like a scorpion or a snake. They're so gorgeous. They're just really beautiful objects. And they would have been, I think from memory, they were left in sort of in temples, is what we think, to bear witness to someone's title deed.
Okay.
But I think our understanding of them is changing, and there's been a lot of interesting research on it more in the last couple of years. So they're enthralling objects.
Very, very cool. Or wait a second. I have somewhere from that same trip to the museum, I have a map on cuneiform. Where did that go? Just because that was something that was new to me. I didn't know that they actually made little maps.
Yeah, they made, and then building plans as well.
Building plans? Are you kidding me?
Yeah, there are lots of building plans, like temple plans and stuff. And actually, the statues of Gudea, he has like a building plan in his lap. It's in stone, but it's...
Here's a Babylonian map, in a sense. They had a few of them on display, and I was totally wowed. I was like, what? I had no idea that there's so much. I need to learn more about Assyriology and cuneiform, clearly. Yeah. Start with your book and conversing with you, and then I got to keep going because, yeah, it's so much richer than you'd imagine. And especially here, this is why I think this was such a clever frame for your book, because you can use these kind of objects that are out of time to then delve into different times and different subjects and different stories from each of these relates to. Are there any really cool kind of land disputes per se like that, like this one, or others, or are there any interesting ones?
They probably are that I just can't think of right now, but they recorded everything, and they have, a very rich tradition of recording lawsuits as well. So they, if there was a land dispute, we probably know about it still today.
See, you are a lawyer. Okay, so we already talked about the mace head and black diorite, and then these I love until I learned what they meant, and I was like, now I no longer love these.
I think I still love them, even though the context for their production is utterly heartbreaking and devastating. So this is a footprint of a toddler whose parents fell on such desperate times that they decided to sell their children into slavery in order for their children to survive. So this was not for them to be able to buy a nice house or something like that. This was because they could no longer feed their children, but someone else could. And there are these feet of the children impressed into clay from the city of Emar, which is in Syria. And they tell us everything about these kids. I mean, their names, their ages, as well as their kind of document found separately that records the event itself. And it's such a dry legal record, but I just, as a parent, can't even imagine what that moment would have been like it was 3 toddlers and a baby that they parted ways with. But I love these footprints because they tell us about these kids. They tell us they existed, and this footprint has survived thousands of years, which is incredible to me, that these are the kinds of stories we can still tell. These are the kinds of stories we can still bear witness to that happened in ancient Mesopotamia. Their names, we know their ages. We know what happened to some of them as well from other documents found in the city. So it's really moving.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's very much that kind of snapshot time travel back in time to sort of, especially if you start comparing images. I forget if you have a second one or not. But,
yeah, there are a couple more. I got really into the...
Yeah, and so you can start to see the different feet that are there impressed from these toddlers that were, in a sense, sold into slavery. And so, yeah, it's touching. And look, I mean, we shouldn't expect all stories from the past to be those with happy endings. The world is a shitty place, as we all know, and it's not all good and roses. And so this is part of what it is. But at the same time, those depressing stories can be touching at the same time.
Yeah.
So these are some of the records of why they fall on hardship and how they're selling their children. Yeah.
Exactly.
So in a sense, this is to help secure the future for the child since they can't afford to feed them. Do they describe it as in that way? That's part of the motivation for it?
I think
Or
because it's such a it's just it's like basically a kind of receipt or contract type of document. It's a really dry record of what happened, and I think it's just described as them having fallen on hard times, or in a year of hardship, I think might be the words that are used. And that's the only explanation given, but we can sort of reconstruct from other sources that of similar situations what would have precipitated that. And it happens in lots of eras, unfortunately, is something that's it's not a unique situation. It's another thing that we know from another situation that we know from many other sources.
Yeah, exactly. There's lots of these. In fact, I've seen a bunch of them in different museums.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, here's another one. Yeah.
Yeah.
From a museum in Italy, I guess, or
I don't
published
actually,
in
I think it's in Syria, but I don't.
Sorry, published in
The source is, yeah, I wanted to
Yeah,
give the source in case anybody wanted to. The source is in Italian, so I couldn't read it, but I could find the objects from them. Someone's at my door, but they shouldn't be, so I'm just going to ignore it.
Okay. If you want to get it, we can pause for a second. It's not a problem.
If they ring again, I'll get up and get it.
Okay. So this again, you are notorious on social media for your dogs.
I love my
And so you also, of course, share these stories about dogs in the past. So yeah, tell us about what we get about pets in cuneiform.
Yes.
Besides their footprints, occasionally.
Besides the footprints, yeah. So this is again. This is copied by a student at school. This kind of telltale shape that you have for school tablets is this round kind of rough draft-esque tablet. But this is a a proverb about a dog, and it says the dog knew take it, but the dog did not know putting it down. And I think anyone who's ever tried to play fetch with a dog has been here.
My dog is like that too. Yeah. So my cat as well. Really good at taking things. Really not good at the rest of it.
Not good at dropping. So yeah, but dogs help them with so many things. I mean, arguably sanitation, eating stuff that was just lying around that you don't want to sit there and rot. War. There are records of feeding dogs who were going into battle, hunting. There are even visual depictions of dogs hunting in the Assyrian reliefs that I was sort of opened with from the first millennium BCE, early part. So dogs were kind of everywhere, and there's a healing goddess called Gula, and there are hymns to her that talk about how if you neglect a hurt dog, then you will incur the wrath of Gula, basically. So there's even this idea of not mistreating them. I mean, I can't say that it's the same that we see today, but there's still that sense that dogs are important to society in some way, and they were especially important to healing. They were associated with the healing goddess quite closely.
There's a healing sanctuary here in Wales from the Roman period that has some really cool dog figurines, and because the saliva of the dog is associated with healing as well. But you mentioned about cleaning up waste, and that triggered. This is one of the lines I wanted to read, where you talk about the waste system at Ur.
Yes.
Woolley's excavation, and Leonard Woolley gives a particularly detailed description of Ur's early 2nd millennium BC lavatories, which did not benefit from central drainage. Unlike those lucky enough to relieve themselves in temples or palaces, quote, the ordinary citizen, Woolley writes, had to make his own arrangements for the disposal of his sewage. So these are the kind of nice little snippets of life that we get. Even to how you get rid of your waste. Yeah. In fact, there's this really cool. It's from a Greek sanctuary, maybe in Afghanistan. I need to look up where, but there's it's somewhere in Central Asia area, but on its inscription it says it translated from Greek. It's "Do not shit in the sanctuary." So some sanctuaries are like that. So one of my favorite things is sanitation and that kind of stuff. I think it's fascinating. I got
That's
to
so
excavate
interesting.
a toilet in Pompeii. That's what I got to excavate on my time there as a student.
That is very cool. That is very cool. I mean, it's an important part of life. Like, imagine life, you know, without.
Yeah, it's extremely important, and to think through how you deal with that. It's important. Okay, so but at the same time, we get more detailed snapshots of people's lives, particularly from letters.
Yes.
So you shared this one. Do you want to tell us what's going on here?
Yeah, so this is so during the Old Assyrian period, so we're talking about 2000 to 1600 BCE in the northern bit of what is now Iraq and then going up into Syria. The Assyrians established a really vast trade network with what is now Turkey. So they had like a trading outpost there called Kanesh, and typically what would happen is that the women would stay in Ashur, in the heartland of Assyria, and weave these incredible textiles that took months and months, and they had to do everything. They had to source the wool, they had to prepare it. I don't actually know how you prepare wool to make a textile, but they had to do that process, and then they had to spin it and create whatever fibers that you then use to make this huge textile. So it's a lot of work. I think up to 6 months for some of these textiles, and then they would send them to Ashur on donkeys, not just donkeys by themselves, but these sort of trading bands would go up into Ashur to their husbands or brothers or whoever had set up shop there. And then those would get traded for copper, tin, and gold even. And then those would then be sent back to Ashur or spent in some cases, by the traders in Kanesh. And this is a letter from one of those women, Lamassi, who, from memory, had 6 children that she had to look after, as well as doing all this textile stuff, as well as sort of making sure there's food, all of which is made from scratch, as well as making her kids' clothing, because there's no, whatever Primark that you can just go to and get clothes for your kids back then. So she had a lot on her plate, and she writes so many letters to her husband that are like, I am tired, basically. Like, I am doing too much stuff. When are you coming home?
Help me with the housework.
Yeah, exactly. And this is a letter, and I've written down what she said. It says something like, for the textiles about which you wrote to me as follows, they are too small, they are not good. Was it not at your own request that I reduced the size? And now you write again, saying as follows, process 1/2 mina of wool more in each of your textiles. Well, I have done so. And as for someone called Urani, he charged a high fee to your representatives for the roof beams that he put in our house, but he has not hired anyone. We thus appeal to your sense of honor. The 10 shekels of copper he took correspond neither to something broken or to the ration for a worker. So she's basically complaining to him that his complaints didn't land very well, understandably. And also saying, like, she's paying for this work to be done and it hasn't been done on the house, like renovations, and yeah, just daily stuff, that someone's dealing with. And that's what I love about letters. You have everything in these letters, even sarcasm, people being like, per my last Cuneiform tablet, which you have not responded
Per my last Cuneiform tablet, you have to get back here and help me with the laundry right away.
Exactly. There's even one from the Neo-Assyrian period, I think, where a sister is writing to a brother, and she's basically like, "Are you alive? Like, I've written to you 100 times, and I haven't seen your messenger yet." So
someone asked in the chat, do we ever see some of the back and forth between the different correspondents? Or in some cases, we do? Okay.
Yeah,
cool.
in some cases we do. I mean, it's often one-sided because we'll find like an archive.
Just the one. Yeah.
But sometimes you do find, both senders and recipients writing back and forth. But they're just such a gold mine for humanity, I think.
Yeah.
And expressions like, sarcastic expressions or even insults that you don't get in like Gilgamesh. You're not going to get that in a literary work or a royal inscription.
Exactly. I mean, in some ways, I think documentary evidence is so much more human than literature, even though, of course, so many people are focused on literature.
Yeah.
There's just this extra human connection of partly, I guess, about it being so real, right? And this stuff is real. These are the real documents, while like a story like Gilgamesh is a story. If you see I mean, which is cool, and you get little human connections in there, but this is real. You know, this is an actual letter between husband and wife.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. So cool.
and we have another one here, letter from Buzazu. Yeah, so this was
Yes.
one of your chapters. Yeah.
Yes, so this is actually in the book, so but I'll drip feed it anyway because it's just so funny. So again, this is another old Assyrian merchant called Buzazu who's come up with a really elaborate smuggling operation in which he instructs the people transporting tin to sew it into their underwear so they don't have to pay any import duties on it. Basically, just avoiding tax, but circa 1600 BCE. This is the letter where he cancels that smuggling operation. But it's another interesting window onto a very human moment of this guy being like, I don't want to pay tax, so what's the workaround? Okay, let's sew tin into our underwear instead. And this is the tablet where he has second thoughts because, at some point people do get in trouble for that in ancient world as well. So
Yeah, yeah. It's exactly how I get stuff through airports.
yeah, so it's sewed into one's underwear.
Yeah,
Time
exactly.
honored tradition.
Very, very cool. Yeah. Okay, so tell us about the songbird now.
Yeah, so this is also in the book, and I thought I wanted to highlight this is based on research by Dr. Eric J. Harvey, who's done a lot of work on blindness in ancient Mesopotamia, but in particular professions and blindness. And this is a really, moving, again, snapshot of a little girl called Shinunutum. And this tablet reads on a particular date. They brought Shinunutum, the blind girl, here before me to learn the art of music. So it's based in Kish, the city of Kish, which is near Babylon, and this little girl has been brought there to learn music. And I just think that that's another example of just like what a wealth of information that you can find in cuneiform tablets that are just so human and so beautiful and so moving.
So, do we have any songs preserved on cuneiform?
Yes, I mean, I don't know that we know how to play them, but there
Okay.
is musical notation,
Oh, there is even musical notation. Cool.
yeah, and there are instructions for tuning instruments as well, which
Oh,
are really interesting. And there are in literary texts, I think in Sumerian in particular, there are references to singing it, or references to it as like a type of song. I think Kidugu or Kidigu or something like that. My like former supervisor, I hope, is never going to watch this because I'm probably getting that completely wrong, and I apologize to everyone. He's just like his specialism is like the Sumerian stuff. So, so there are hints, and then there are obviously musical instruments excavated, for example, from the Royal Cemetery at Ur, like the
yeah, the lyres.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So there are lots of hints at what music might have sounded like, but I don't know that we've fully deciphered how to kind of play a song from start to finish, or if there is anything that instructive that has been left
I'll
behind.
have to ask Bettina Joy de Guzman. I'm going to have her on the channel at some point. She plays ancient music
Cool.
on lyres and stuff like that. And so mostly ancient Greek music, but maybe she knows something about Sumerian or Akkadian music. I could ask her.
I think she might have done something for instrument.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me. She's done so much awesome. And if for anyone listening, go check out my video on the Oracle of Delphi. The musical background to it is all from her performing. So she just does a great job. She has a great YouTube channel too, and
Amazing.
albums.
Mm.
Okay. Do you want to? I forget how long you have. Do you want to keep moving through these, or do you want to go to questions? What do you want to do?
I think we can probably maybe go to questions because I think I probably have about 20, 30 more minutes.
Yeah. So
Okay.
let's skip through a few of these. I want to give a chance to my patrons and members. One of the new perks I am offering to people to support the channel regularly through membership and patron is to get a chance to ask questions in advance. So these are the 3 questions that were submitted for you. These are tough ones. So how literate were ancient Mesopotamians? Could most people read these receipts and documents? Do we have any examples of literature?
Okay, that's a great question. And it's a great question because there's no easy answer. It depends on the time period and it depends on the people. So, the old Assyrian period, since that's fresh, I think, in our minds, people learned enough science to be able to write those letters. Uh,
Hmm.
but it wasn't everyone. It was just the people who needed to write those letters that would bother to learn like a repertoire of, let's say, 100 signs or something like that. So we would call that sort of semi-literate society or era. But typically, um, literacy was reserved for those who were going to train to become scribes or scholars or both. And in that included girls and women in some eras as well. There's quite good evidence that not as much as there is for boys and men, but there is evidence, for example, from if we're staying in the old Assyrian period for a second, so the same time period, but further south in Babylonia. There were groups of women who lived together called Naditum. They were a
Hmm.
type. They were thought. They're thought to be a kind of type of priestess, or something attached to the temple, and they lived in these cloistered communities. And they learned to read. Many of them learned to read and write to record their own business transactions. And so there's, for example, there are scribes who are women who worked for decades during that era. But for the most part, we have to kind of acknowledge that the sources tell us this is mainly the domain of men, and and is quite a restricted domain throughout most periods of Mesopotamian history. And they went to school, as we talked about the school tablets, and then
Hmm.
eventually some of them just went on to become scribes in administration. So they would do legal documents, receipts, letters, etc. But some went on to be scholars who specialized and even did additional education, for example, veterinary work and medicine to become physicians or different kinds of medical professionals. There were a few different kinds at the time. So, yeah, it's a great question because there are so many different ways to answer it.
Yeah, and that's actually kind of interesting, this kind of tradition of so much scholarship, let's say, because we've talked about, say, astronomy, math, medicine. We've
Mhm,
talked about translating between even dead languages that were gone from thousands of years ago. I
mhm.
mean, this is like the kind of stuff that's being cut in UK universities all around us, is the ability to do these kind of things.
Yeah.
And so it's just like this tradition of say higher education and really of learning dead languages and learning advanced medicine and astronomy and stuff like that. We have this evidence stretching back thousands of years as part of some people's education. So that's kind of interesting to see. Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay. Second question: how did ancient climate change and environmental changes impact Mesopotamian society?
So I think one way to answer that is it kind of made it possible for writing to come about.
Huh?
So um, the
After
climate,
the 4.2K event?
yeah, sort of the reverse of what climate change is doing now in a way. Um,
Aha.
the climate in southern Iraq in the 4000s to 3000s BC was quite different to how it was from sort of 3000 BCE onward. And sea level also changed. So I'm not a climate scientist, but I imagine that's somewhat related to climate, how sea level fluctuates and things being tied up in ice or
Hmm.
otherwise. So sometime between the 3000s and 4000 to 4000s BC, sea level gets a bit lower, and so it kind of drains this floodplain a little bit in southern Iraq. And it makes it possible for people to farm a little bit more predictably, and it makes flooding a lot more seasonal. And it was really well borne out in the archaeological record, I think, from the era just before writing was developed around 3350 BCE or 3200 BCE, from that first tablet, that one of the first things we looked at in the slides. There were only about 10 settlements that were uncovered. And then from the era after that, there are about 100 settlements in that area. So it makes it much easier to settle there. But
Yeah.
it drains the floodplain, which makes it easier to do good agriculture. And that alongside some other agricultural innovations like irrigation technologies and other forms of agricultural technology that they developed made them better at farming. And being so good at farming, they had too much produce to keep track of, which meant they needed to create some kind of technology to keep track of information, which is when you get the birth of writing. And then also, the drained landscape leaves behind the silty soil, which and part of that is clay, which becomes a medium for writing. So I think that's like my favorite way to kind of think about that question, is that climate, in a way, climate change made all these developments. They set the stage for all these developments, but climate change also affected things negatively. So, for example, we're still trying to work out why the Neo-Assyrian Empire fell so drastically in the 600s BC, in the early 600s. And one possible explanation is that there were like sort of back-to-back droughts. So there, for example, there are references to droughts in this mid 600s BCE during the reign of Ashurbanipal, despite his royal inscriptions talking about how everything's perfect and plentiful. There is a letter from an astrologer whose name I forget, talking about how there's a drought and the harvest yielded nothing that year. And then there are transactions that refer to a year of whatever the opposite of plenty, dearth, for example. So we know that climate became a problem in that time period. And then climate, it's also maybe explain it may be able to explain the fall of other kind of dynasties in ancient Mesopotamia. So I think it's a great question, because it's something that we're facing now, and we have examples of how climate change can be very destructive and change the course of history.
Yeah, I'll ping you again, because that's what I want my second book to be on, and I published on some of this topic in Greece, and so I want to do a series of videos on ancient climate change is one of my goals.
Yeah.
To try to show both the ways that it can positively impact society and the ways it can negatively impact society. Because, I think you answered both ways really, really nicely here. And I know some of the people that work on that stuff in the Neo-Assyrian period, like Adam Schneider. He's published on some of that, and others, some of the paleoclimatologists are some of the same people I work with in Greece. Okay, so third question. There is a reference to an ice house. So again, I guess started thinking about weather or something like that in a tablet from Mari. Any other info you know about ice houses?
Yeah, it's a great question. So as far as I know, we don't have archaeological evidence for these, but in particular in Mari and in that time period, there are a lot of references to ice and ice houses. And actually, we can go back to Shulgi, whose statue fragment was found in the museum, or museum without quotes. And there's a year name. So one of the ways people dated documents in ancient Mesopotamia was by giving something called a year name, which was a kind of highlights reel for a king's reign. They only use these until a certain point, then these get replaced by year 1 of so-and-so's reign, year 9 of so-and-so's reign. But in Shulgi's time, each year was named after a particular event, and one of those events was year the royal ice house was built. So yeah, and it's in Sumerian. I don't know what the Sumerian for it is. I know in Akkadian it's I think it's shuripim is the word for ice here. But yeah, so there are letters between the king's staff and him in Mari, and this is in the old Babylonian period, so around between 2000 and 1600 BC. I should really know when Zimri-Lim ruled, but I can't remember. Again, I'm bad at dates. And in one letter, someone is talking about giving a gift to the Elamites of wine, sheep, and ice, which I love.
Okay. That goes well together, like a nice lamb ribs with some iced wine.
Yes, exactly. And then there are other letters that deal with like the collection and storage of ice. So maybe that tells us that ice was collected when it was cold, or from somewhere like mountains where it was cold. And then the challenge then becomes storing it instead of creating it. In which case it makes sense for that to be underground and not then subject to weather changes, especially when it gets hot. And I think there are some references to like digging to put ice away. So who knows if the archaeological evidence for this will ever materialize, but I can't imagine that they would have made all this stuff up. It just seems too random. So I think
I'm sure, but it might be tough to tell that it's for ice, because ice melts.
Yes.
So, and it doesn't leave a chemical signature that we could detect, because it's just water. But no, very, very fascinating. Okay, so we'll open up the floor for questions. ask questions now in the chat. I'm going to throw up this image of a photo my wife Yoni took while at the Penn Museum. This is Queen Puabi's headdress.
Yes.
And she lined up her face so that it reflects off the glass that was there. And so just like we can see ourselves through cuneiform tablets, we can try to do that in museums too. So if you're ever in Philadelphia, go check out the new exhibit on at the Penn Museum, and that's there. I guess I should say I'm a consulting scholar of the Penn Museum, so I have my reasons for promoting it, I guess. But they don't really pay me. But yeah. But okay, so yeah, I think this is great. It's been great to actually start to think of these stories and how we can see this, and I hope everybody goes and is inspired to get Dr. Al-Rashid's new book, Between Two Rivers. It'll be on sale. It's on sale right now in the UK, and it'll be on sale in the US, I guess you said in August or something like that?
That's right, yeah.
So maybe we'll have you back on to finish the slide presentation in August when that comes out. In the meantime, let's see what we have from our chat. We have, is AI being utilized to decipher tablets?
Yes, I feel like a total imposter trying to explain this, but I'm going to do my best anyway. The challenge is that the tablets are 3D. So you're basically training it to read pictures and not language, or not, writing. So that's the challenge. But once I think AI does a pretty good job of translating once the tablets have been drawn, once the signs have been drawn in a kind of much more readable way. So there is that kind of currently challenge layer of getting it to read the actual 3D tablets, which would be amazing because it would unlock, oh my gosh, thousands and thousands of sources. And it's sort of good enough now with the written out, the drawn out signs. Like one of the slides showed the statue fragment shoulder, the signs drawn out, much easier to read than on the actual object. It's not perfect, so you'd still need a trained Assyriologist to, yes, exactly, that's the one. You still need a trained Assyriologist to go through and like correct stuff and reinterpret things, but it's a start. I mean, it cuts out hours of work. I don't know if that necessarily justifies it because I have views on AI, but that is that's the best way I can answer that question. There are people way better qualified than me in the field, yeah, some of them are on Blue Sky.
I mean, I think scholars using machine learning is different from ChatGPT learning from like ripped off sources, if you see what I mean.
I do.
So that's a bit different, because and it's also why I think the term AI is stupid. A lot of it is actually just machine learning, and we can feed our own data sets and evidence in there to train. And so I know people working on that for other things. And so that is ethically different because they're getting all the permissions involved to use that material in advance. I mean, they should be. I don't know if they actually are. I don't know all the details behind what they're doing, but they should be if they're doing good scholarship. Just like if you're going to publish stuff. Another question. Are there any plans for future digs in Iraq? I'm guessing yes, but you might know more.
Yeah, there's an amazing dig going on now in Nippur, which was kind of traditionally the kind of religious center of ancient Mesopotamia. It's much more complicated than that. It is also the source of many school tablets from around 1800. And there's a professor called Augusta McMahon on Twitter, and maybe also Blue Sky, I think, sharing photos from the dig every day. So there's lots of archaeological work going on in Iraq at the moment.
Yeah.
That's just the one I can think of right now.
Another question here. I may have missed this, but what tools are thought to have been used in Mesopotamian carvings?
Amazing question that I actually have no idea. I can read them. I just don't know what they use to chisel them. That's a really good question. I don't know. I'm going to look that up, actually. See if I can.
Yeah, probably other stones and bronze is my guess from comparable cultures. Have
to be hard.
And then certainly I saw somewhere, I'm not going to scroll all the way up the chat because there's so many messages, but someone was saying that it must take so long to create these tablets. But you tell in the book that actually, especially by the time they get the shorthand versions, that it's actually quite quick to record with the wedges into clay, right?
Yeah, it's pretty fast. I mean, I can't do it fast, but if I practiced enough, it's very fast.
And so in a sense, that's why they move from these kind of ideograms or whatever towards these wedges and whatnot, and they drop off, as you see, so many different parts to them to make them more simplified, so that they go much faster, right?
Yeah.
And then that's why we have so many friggin' tablets, right? Because they were able to do it pretty well. That's the question I've got. If you had to just guess, how many tablets are there?
I think
Millions?
number, I don't know about millions, but there are at least, I want to say there are at least 250,000 not digitized, but cataloged in the Cuneiform
Okay.
Digital Library Initiative, which is an online database, an incredible resource for the study of these tablets, and also an incredible resource for beautiful photographs. So anyone anywhere can look at a tablet, which is incredible.
What's the name of that resource? The what?
It's called the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative, or CDLI. I think if
Okay.
you just
Let me
search,
pop the link in the chat.
it's
for
an
people.
incredible collaborative effort, and it links to other websites. Each tablet might have links to other open access sources in the field that might give a translation or more context, or a museum page, for example. So it's pretty spectacular source.
Okay. And then, yeah, there's just so many of these out there that you sort of need to be a specialist to know where to find all
Yeah.
these, repositories of information, even though they're publicly available, right?
Yes. Exactly.
So how about this one? How do you read the tablets? Up, down, left, right, in a circle? All of the above?
All the above, no. And so so even though, again, the era I specialize in is kind of Assyrian, Babylonian cultures until about 300, 200 BCE. And the language they use is Akkadian and various dialects of it, which is a Semitic language, as I mentioned earlier. And normally a Semitic language is written from right to left, but Cuneiform is read, no matter what the language is, from, as far as I know, left to right, including the Akkadian tablets. So left to right, top to bottom, just like
Okay.
we read a document in French or English, or yeah, most of the languages that possibly those listening work with, because it's in English.
Yes. Here, there's an earlier question, which is a good one, that relates to something I'm intrigued in. Did they use signage in any way similar to how we use it today? Would there have been a base literacy where a symbol was understood to mean the baker by everybody?
I love that question. I have no idea. That's such a great question. The only thing I mean, this is like not at all answering the question, but this is the only thing I can think of that's very vaguely tangentially related, is that when they kind of give addresses, they'll say something is next to the thing, this thing or that thing. They'll sort of give addresses in relation to other things. So they must have had a sense of where things were, but how they would have had that, I don't know. They must have. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. That's a great question.
Yeah. So this is a follow-up on this. So
Mhm.
when you think about these logograms in different languages, is the same word for the baker used, or the same symbol for the baker used in every different language, for example? I'm just giving an example of the baker. Maybe you have a better one, but yeah.
Yeah, yes, it is. So you'll have an Akkadian text, for example, because I work with the history of science. So a lot of the scientific texts, medical texts, and astronomical texts will use a lot of logograms. There are lots of ideological reasons for that, but also maybe it was just faster to write one sign instead of a whole word out. And for example, the word for heart, libu in Akkadian, is often represented with a single logogram, which is the Sumerian word is shah. But it's just one sign that looks like a chest, sort of.
Huh.
And if you're reading it in an Akkadian text, let's say if a man, his heart is broken, you would read that word as libu when you're reading the tablet out. And when you're transliterating and translating it, you would use the Akkadian word, even though it originally is a Sumerian sign. So each sign kind of has their own layers of history, but you would still read them in your language, even if the sign doesn't change, representing that word. I feel like that was a really kind of confusing response, but hopefully.
Oh, I think it makes sense. I mean, yeah, so they're using these same things, but they'll be obviously pronounced and whatever differently in different languages because they're different languages.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that's what happens, of course, when you use the example of emojis in your book, and
Mm,
sort of the heart emoji. We understand that in different languages. So someone texting in French might use the heart emoji, but of course they're not going to say heart. They're going to say le coeur, like that's just, yeah. So that's just life. So last one, because I know you got to go. How accurate is our modern pronunciation of Akkadian?
We think it's very accurate. Akkadian is very sort of firmly deciphered, and we have hints from other Semitic languages on. We had the early decipherers had hints from other Semitic languages once they realized what they were working with on how things could be pronounced. But the Akkadians and the Babylonians, Assyrians, and Sumerians had left copious kind of lists of words and signs and how to pronounce them as well. So once you decipher enough signs, you can sort of get to the pronunciation of things, which is, I think, incredible, because you can read a tablet out loud, and that's maybe what it sounded like, exactly what it sounded like back 4,000 years ago when it was first made. So it's pretty accurate.
Very, very cool. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Al-Rashid. Everybody go check out the book. I cannot recommend it enough. And yeah, it was really great. And thank you all for checking in, tuning in. And make sure you hit like, leave a comment. Let's feed the algorithm so that we can get this stuff out there, because that's how we have to fight back against all the crap that's on social media. Is we have to work to boost each other. So like, comment, share, etc. Thank you all. Love and archaeology, and in this case, cuneiform to everybody.